disturbing. Tonight, we are plunging into the dark heart of the Appalachian Mountains with some truly unsettling true horror stories that will keep you up all night, if you're brave enough. Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into fear. Now, get comfortable. Relax. I was 12 years old when I first heard tell of the Whispering Woman, though the memory of that night still sits heavy in my chest some 30 years later. It was during a Boy Scout camping trip to Black Rock Ridge, deep in the Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains, where the old-growth forest still holds secrets that go back centuries. Our troop had hiked up from the valley that morning, our packs heavy with gear and our spirits high with the adventure of it all. Camp leader Morrison, we called him Mo, was a local man who'd grown up in these very mountains. His weathered face told stories before his mouth ever opened, and his eyes held that particular wisdom you only find in folks who've spent their whole lives listening to what the mountains have to say. We'd set up our tents in a clearing surrounded by towering oaks and maples, their branches forming a natural cathedral overhead. The air smelled of pine needles and rich earth, with that crisp edge that only comes when you're high enough up that the world below feels like another place entirely. As evening settled in, we gathered around the fire pit Mo had built with stones he claimed were older than any of our great-grandfathers. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up toward the first stars beginning to show themselves through the canopy. We'd finished our beans and franks, and the night was settling into that peaceful quiet that makes you feel small and safe all at once. That's when Mo cleared his throat and looked around at our circle of eager faces, the firelight dancing in his deep-set eyes. "You boys want to hear something that'll make you appreciate these old mountains a little more?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular cadence mountain folk use when they're about to share something important. Of course we did. 13 boys between the ages of 11 and 14, full of bravado and s'mores, leaning forward like flowers toward the sun. Mo poked at the fire with a long stick, sending up a shower of orange sparks. "Well then, let me tell you about the Whispering Woman of Black Rock Ridge. She's been walking these mountains longer than anyone can remember, and she's got a particular fondness for children who wander too far from the fire's light." He paused, letting the wind through the trees provide the only sound for a long moment. The fire settled with a soft whoosh, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out into the darkness. Story goes back to the Cherokee days, before white settlers ever set foot in these mountains. There was a woman. Some say she was a medicine woman, others claim she was something else entirely, who lived alone up on the highest peak of this very ridge. The Cherokee called her envelop, the one who listens, because she had the gift of hearing things others couldn't. Whispers on the wind, voices of the dead, secrets the mountains themselves kept hidden in their ancient hollows. The fire popped again, and I jumped slightly. Mo noticed and smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile that said he knew something we didn't. Now, envelop wasn't evil, not at first. She helped folks when they came to her, found lost children, healed the sick, spoke with spirits to bring peace to troubled hearts. But something happened to her up there in the loneliness of those peaks. Maybe it was hearing too many voices, too many secrets. Maybe it was the weight of all that knowledge pressing down on her mind like a stone. Whatever it was, she started to change. He stood up then, walking around the fire as he spoke, his shadow stretching long and strange across our faces. People started noticing that children who played too far from home would come back different. They'd be quiet, distant, like part of them had stayed behind in the mountains. Some said they'd heard the children talking to themselves in the woods, carrying on conversations with someone who wasn't there, and always, they'd speak of a kind woman who whispered such beautiful things to them, secrets about the forest and promises about places they could go where no one would ever hurt them again. The wind picked up then, rattling the leaves above us and making the fire dance wildly. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The Cherokee elders grew worried. They sent a group of their wisest men up to Envelop's peak to see what had become of their medicine woman. What they found? Mo paused, shaking his head slowly. What they found was a woman who'd forgotten how to be human. She'd been alone with the voices so long that she'd started believing she was one of them. Her eyes had turned the color of mountain mist, and when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the wind itself was talking. "What happened to her?" asked Tommy Hendricks, the youngest of our group, his voice barely above a whisper. Mo sat back, down, leaning forward into the firelight. The elders tried to help her, tried to bring her back to the world of the living, but Imvigvuvna didn't want to come back. She'd found something up there in the loneliness, a peace that came from not having to be part of the world anymore. So, she made a choice. She let go of her human form and became something else, something that could live forever in the spaces between the trees, in the whispers of the wind through the leaves. "And she's still here?" I asked, my own voice sounding strange in my ears. "Oh, she's still here all right. Every mountain family's got stories about her. She appears to children who've wandered away from safety, offers to show them wonders they've never imagined. She whispers to them about secret paths through the forest, about hidden places where the world is different, more magical. Most children are smart enough to run home to their parents. But some," he let the word hang in the air like smoke, "some listen too long to her whispers, and when they do, they start to forget about the world they came from. They start to believe that the forest is their real home, that the voices she shows them are their real family, and bit by bit, they fade away from the living world until they become whispers themselves, echoing through these mountains forever." The fire had burned down to glowing coals by then, and the darkness seemed to press in closer around our small circle. I could hear the night sounds of the forest, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of a screech owl, the soft sigh of wind through pine boughs. "Of course, that's just an old story," Mo said, standing up and brushing ash from his hands. "Probably nothing to it, but all the same, boys, you stay close to camp tonight. These old mountains have long memories, and sometimes..." He looked out into the darkness beyond our fire. "Sometimes they like to remind us that we're just visitors here." That night, I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the tent ceiling, listening to the breathing of my tent mate Danny Morrison, Mo's nephew, who'd fallen asleep the moment his head hit his pillow. The canvas walls of our tent seemed thin as paper, and every sound from the forest outside seemed amplified in the darkness. At first, it was just the normal sounds you'd expect: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the occasional crack of a twig as some small animal moved through the underbrush. But as the night wore on, those sounds began to feel different somehow, more purposeful, like they were forming a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. I found myself straining to listen, holding my breath to catch every whisper of wind through the trees, and that's when I first heard it, so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A sound like someone moving through the forest, but not walking exactly, more like gliding, the way you might move if your feet barely touched the ground. My heart started beating faster, and I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a bear passing through. Mountain animals were quiet after all. They knew how to move without making much noise. But as the sound drew closer to our campsite, I realized it wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever heard. It was too deliberate, too careful, like someone, or something, was trying very hard not to be noticed. I wanted to wake Danny, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, not wanting to seem like a scared little kid. Or maybe it was something deeper, an instinct that told me drawing attention to myself might not be the wisest thing just then. The movement stopped somewhere just outside our tent. I could feel a presence there, patient and waiting, like a cat watching a mouse hole. The night sounds of the forest had gone completely quiet, as if every creature in the woods was holding its breath. That's when I heard the whisper. It was so soft I might have mistaken it for the wind if the air hadn't been perfectly still. A woman's voice, gentle and kind, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, but that seemed to carry meanings beyond language. The sound seemed to come from right outside our tent, but also from much farther away, like an echo of an echo. "Come see," the voice seemed to say, though the words weren't quite words. Come see the beautiful things." I felt a strange pull then, an urge to unzip the tent flap and step outside. The voice was so inviting, so full of promise. Whatever was out there wanted to show me something wonderful, something secret and special, that only I would get to see. My hand actually moved toward the tent zipper before I caught myself. Something about the way the voice made me feel, that dreamy, distant sensation, reminded me uncomfortably of Mo's story. I pulled my hand back and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will the presence away. But it didn't leave. Instead, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. I could make out words now, spoken in a voice like water flowing over stones. "Such a clever boy," it said. "Such a brave boy, to come so far up into my mountains. Would you like to see where the paths lead? Would you like to know the secrets the trees keep?" The tent wall near my head suddenly bulged inward, as if something was pressing against it from outside. Not hard, not threatening, but gently, the way a mother might stroke a child's cheek. I could see the outline of what might have been fingers through the thin canvas, though they seemed too long, too delicate to be entirely human. "The others don't understand," the voice continued, and now it seemed to come from all around me, as if the tent itself was speaking. "They think the world down below is all there is. But you're different, aren't you? You can feel it, how small that world is, how ordinary. I could show you places where every day is an adventure, where you'd never be bored or lonely again." I wanted to scream, to wake Danny, to call out for Mo, but my throat felt frozen, and when I tried to move, my limbs felt heavy as stone. The whispers were getting inside my head somehow, making my thoughts feel slow and distant. "Just step outside," the voice coaxed. "Just for a moment. Just to see." The pressure against the tent wall increased slightly, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was out there was slowly, carefully trying to work the zipper down from the outside. The tiny metal teeth made the softest possible sound as they separated, barely audible but distinct in the perfect silence of the night. That small sound, so deliberate, so purposeful, broke whatever spell had been settling over me. I sucked in a sharp breath and finally found my voice. "Danny," I whispered urgently, reaching over to shake my tent mate. "Danny, wake up." The moment I spoke, everything changed. The pressure against the tent wall vanished instantly, and the night sounds of the forest rushed back in like water filling a void. Somewhere in the distance I heard what might have been laughter, or might have been the wind through the trees, fading away into the depths of the forest. Danny stirred and mumbled something incomprehensible but didn't wake up. I lay there, in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening for any sign that whatever had been outside our tent was coming back. But the night remained normal after that, just the usual sounds of a forest after dark, nothing more sinister than an occasional owl call or the rustle of leaves. Still, I didn't sleep another minute until dawn began to lighten the tent walls, and I could hear Mo moving around the camp, starting the morning fire. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with that particular golden quality mountain sunlight has when it filters through ancient trees. I crawled out of my sleeping bag feeling groggy and disoriented, like I was waking up from the strangest dream of my life. But as I stepped outside the tent, the first thing I noticed made my blood run cold. There, pressed into the soft earth, around our tent was a circle of footprints. Not animal tracks, definitely human, but wrong somehow. Too narrow, with toes that seemed unnaturally long, and so light they'd barely made an impression in the dirt. I was staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around to find Mo standing behind me, 2 cups of coffee in his hands and a curious expression on his weathered face. "Sleep well?" he asked, offering me one of the cups. Did you walk around our tent last night?" I asked, pointing at the footprints. Mo set down his coffee and knelt beside the marks, studying them with the careful attention of someone who'd spent his whole life reading sign in the wilderness. After a long moment, he stood up and brushed the dirt from his hands. "Wasn't me," he said simply. "These are too small to be mine anyway." He paused, looking at me with those knowing eyes. "You hear anything last night?" I wanted to tell him everything, about the whispers, the presence outside our tent, the way the voice had tried to lure me outside. But in the bright morning light, with the coffee warming my hands and the normal sounds of a waking camp around us, it all seemed impossible, like something my imagination had conjured up after too many campfire stories. Maybe, I said instead. I thought I heard someone walking around. Mo nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. Mountain nights can play tricks on you, he said, especially up here on the ridge. Sound carries strange sometimes, and the shadows make you see things that might not be there. But as we broke camp that morning, I noticed Mo watching the tree line more carefully than he had the day before. And when Tommy Hendricks mentioned that he'd had weird dreams about a lady who wanted him to come outside, Mo's expression grew thoughtful in a way that made me think he was taking it more seriously than his casual words suggested. The hike down the mountain was uneventful, filled with the usual boy talk about baseball and bikes and the upcoming school year, but I found myself looking back over my shoulder more than once, feeling like something was watching us leave from the shadows, between the trees. It wasn't until we were loading our gear into the van at the trailhead that Mo pulled me aside. That story I told last night, he said quietly. It's not just a story, you know. My grandmother used to tell it to me when I was about your age, and her grandmother told it to her. Goes back generations in these mountains. Do you think... I started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the question. I think these old mountains have their own ways, Mo said. And I think sometimes, especially when the night is quiet and the moon is dark, those ways make themselves known to folks who are paying attention. He looked back toward the ridge we'd just descended. Whatever you heard up there, son, you did right not following it. Some invitations are better left unanswered. That was 30 years ago, but I still think about that night sometimes. I've been back to Black Rock Ridge a few times since then, as an adult with my own children, in fact. And during the daylight hours, it's just a beautiful piece of Virginia wilderness, no different from 100 other mountains in the Blue Ridge. But I've never stayed overnight there again. I did some research over the years, curious about the story Mo had told us. Turns out there really was a Cherokee tradition about mountain spirits who could speak to children, though the details varied from one telling to another. Some called her a medicine woman who'd lost her way. Others said she was something older, something that had been in the mountains since long before humans ever walked there. What I found most interesting, though, was that the Cherokee name Mo had used, NVHI Governor, actually translates closer to the one who calls, rather than the one who listens. A small difference, maybe, but one that stuck with me all these years. I never did figure out who made those footprints around our tent, or what I really heard whispering in the darkness that night. Maybe it was an elaborate prank by some of the older scouts, though none of them ever admitted to it, and Mo seemed genuinely puzzled by the whole thing. Maybe it was just the combination of a 12-year-old's imagination and the power of a well-told story on a dark mountain night. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed on particularly quiet nights, I remember the way that voice sounded. So gentle, so inviting, so absolutely certain that it had something wonderful to show me. And I remember the feeling of those fingers pressing against the tent wall, patient and persistent, waiting for me to make the choice that would change everything. Even now, I can't be sure if it was just a prank, or if something really came, calling that night in the mountains. Something that's still up there on Black Rock Ridge, whispering to children who wander too far from the safety of the fire's light. I was 13 when I first laid eyes on the widow of Crow's Hollow, though I wouldn't learn her real name until I was well into my 40s. Back then, in the autumn of 1987, she was just the witch who lived up in the mountains above our little town of Cedar Falls, West Virginia, a figure of whispered warnings and childhood dares. Cedar Falls wasn't much to speak of, even then. A cluster of houses spread along Blackwater Creek with a general store, a post office, and a church that drew maybe 30 souls on a good Sunday. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody. Else's business and stories got passed down like heirloom quilts, growing more elaborate with each telling. The story of the witch in Crow's Hollow was one of those tales that had been around longer than anyone could remember. She lived alone up there in a ramshackle cabin, the old folks said, practicing dark magic and cursing anyone who crossed her path. Children who ventured too close to her hollow would disappear or come back changed, speaking in tongues and knowing things they shouldn't know. The smart thing, everyone agreed, was to stay well clear of that part of the mountain. But at 13, smart wasn't something I was particularly good at. Neither was my best friend Marcus Webb, who lived 3 houses down from us and shared my taste for trouble. We'd been exploring the mountains around Cedar Falls since we were old enough to walk. But Crow's Hollow had always been off limits, which naturally made it irresistible. It was Marcus who finally dared me to make the hike. We were sitting on the front steps of Caldwell's General Store, sharing a bottle of Coca-Cola and watching the leaves turn gold on the mountainsides when he brought it up. "My cousin Jimmy says he saw her last week," Marcus said, lowering his voice like he was sharing state secrets. "Says she was gathering herbs up near the old mine shaft, talking to herself in some foreign language." "Jimmy's full of it," I replied, but I was listening. Maybe. But what if he's not? What if she really is up there, doing all that witchcraft stuff the old folks talk about? I took a long swig of Coke, feeling the burn in my throat. So what if she is? Marcus grinned, and I knew I was in trouble. When Marcus Webb grinned like that, it usually meant we were about to do something that would get us grounded for a week. So let's go see for ourselves. The plan was simple enough. Hike up to Crow's Hollow on Saturday morning, take a look around, and be back by dinner time. We told our parents we were going fishing down at Miller's Pond, packed some sandwiches and water, and set off through the woods behind the old cemetery. The trail to Crow's Hollow wasn't much more than a deer path winding up through thick stands of oak and maple. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the leaves crunched under our boots as we climbed higher into the mountains. It should have been a beautiful hike, the kind of autumn day that makes you grateful to be alive in the Appalachians. But the closer we got to the hollow, the more wrong everything felt. It started with the silence. The woods around Cedar Falls were usually alive with sound, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But as we climbed higher, those sounds faded away until we were walking through a forest as quiet as a tomb. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was swallowing up the sound. Then there were the trees. About halfway up the mountain, we started noticing that some of the oaks had strange symbols carved into their bark, crude shapes that might have been letters or might have been something else entirely. They looked old, weathered by years of rain and snow, but still deep enough to catch your eye. "What do you think those mean?" Marcus whispered, running his finger along one of the carvings. I shrugged, trying to look braver than I felt. Probably just some old hunter marking his territory. But I didn't believe it, and neither did he. The hollow itself was a natural bowl in the mountainside, surrounded by steep ridges that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. A thin creek ran through the center, barely more than a trickle this late in the season, and the air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. It was the kind of place that would have been beautiful in a photograph, but felt oppressive when you were standing in it. The cabin sat on the far side of the creek, built into the hillside like it had grown there naturally. It was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 2 rooms at most, with walls of weathered wood and a roof covered in moss and fallen leaves. Smoke drifted from the chimney, gray and thin in the still air. "She's home," Marcus breathed, and I felt my heart skip a beat. We crouched behind a fallen log about 50 yards from the cabin, watching and waiting. For a long time, nothing happened. The smoke continued to rise from the chimney, and occasionally we could hear the faint sound of movement from inside. Footsteps on wooden floors, the clink of dishes, the creak of old furniture. Then the door opened. She was smaller than I'd expected and older, probably in her 70s, with long gray hair that hung loose around her shoulders and a face carved with deep lines. She wore a simple brown dress that had seen better days, and her feet were bare despite the cool air. In her hands she carried a wooden bucket. For a moment she stood in the doorway, perfectly still, and I had the strangest feeling that she was listening to something we couldn't hear. Then she stepped outside and walked slowly toward the creek. That's when I saw her eyes. They were The palest blue I've ever seen, so light they were almost white, and when she knelt by the water to fill her bucket, she looked directly at our hiding place. Not past us, not through us, but right at us, as if that fallen log was made of glass. She smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, or a threatening one. If anything, it seemed almost sad, like she was looking at something that made her feel sorry for us. But there was something about it that made my blood run cold, something that spoke to the deepest, most primitive part of my brain and screamed danger. "Run," I whispered to Marcus, and we ran. We crashed through the underbrush like a pair of spooked deer, branches whipping at our faces and roots trying to trip us with every step. Behind us, I could swear I heard laughter. Not the cackle of a movie witch, but the gentle musical laughter of an old woman who'd found something amusing. Somehow, that was worse than any scream would have been. We didn't stop running until we reached the cemetery, and even then we kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see that pale figure following us down the mountain. By the time we made it back to town, we were both shaking and out of breath, but we were also exhilarated. We'd seen the Witch of Crow's Hollow with our own eyes and lived to tell about it. The story grew in the telling, of course. By the time we shared it with our friends, the old woman had been performing some kind of ritual by the creek, chanting in a language that made the very air shimmer. By the end of the week, she'd cast a spell that made the trees bleed, and we'd barely escaped with our souls intact. But even then, even in the safety of my own bedroom, I couldn't shake the memory of those pale eyes and that sad, knowing smile. 32 years later, I found myself back in Cedar Falls for my mother's funeral. The town had changed. The general store was gone, replaced by a gas station with a small convenience mart, and half the houses I remembered from childhood stood empty and abandoned. But the mountains were the same, and as I stood in the cemetery, where we'd buried my mother, I found myself looking up toward Crow's Hollow. After the service, I ran into Marcus at the diner that had replaced the old soda fountain. He'd stayed in the area, married his high school sweetheart, and worked for the county road department. We spent an hour catching up on old times, and inevitably, the conversation turned to our childhood adventure. "You remember that witch we saw up in the hollow?" Marcus asked, stirring sugar into his coffee. How could I forget? He was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the mountains. Funny thing is, I was talking to old Pete Saunders last week. You remember Pete, used to run the post office, and he told me something interesting about that place. Yeah? Turns out there never was any witch up there. Not the way we thought, anyway. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice out of old habit. "Pete says the woman who lived up there was named Elizabeth Crane, came to the hollow sometime in the 1940s, after her husband died in the war. She was from back east somewhere, Pennsylvania maybe, and didn't have any family left." He paused, sipping his coffee. "Anyway, she bought that little piece of land dirt cheap because nobody wanted it. Too remote, too hard to get to. Built that cabin with her own hands and lived there for 40-odd years, mostly keeping to herself. Used to come into town maybe once a month for supplies, but she never bothered anybody and mostly people left her alone." "So what happened to her?" "Died in the winter of '89, about 2 years after we saw her. Pete says they didn't find her body until spring when the snow melted. She'd been dead for months." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. "But why did everyone think she was a witch?" Marcus shrugged. "You know how it is in small towns. Woman living alone, doesn't talk to anybody, keeps strange hours. People start making up stories to explain what they don't understand. And once those stories get started, they take on a life of their own," I finished. "Exactly. Pete says she was actually a pretty educated lady, had been a teacher back east before the war. But she was also what you might call eccentric. Used to study plants and herbs, kept detailed journals about the local wildlife, probably knew more about these mountains than anybody else alive." I thought about the symbols we'd seen carved into the trees, the ones that had seemed so mysterious and threatening. Those markings we saw, field markers most likely, ways to remember where she'd found interesting specimens or good places to gather herbs. Nothing more sinister than that. We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Marcus spoke again. Makes you feel kind of bad, doesn't it? Here was this lonely old woman just trying to live her life in peace, and we turned her into some kind of monster. I nodded, but I was thinking about more than just childhood guilt. I was thinking about Elizabeth Crane, living alone in that hollow for 40 years, watching the seasons change and the forest grow. What must it have been like for her, knowing that the people in town whispered about her, feared her, told stories that made her out to be something evil? And I was thinking about that smile, the one that had haunted my dreams for 30 years. Maybe it hadn't been the smile of a witch at all. Maybe it had been the smile of a woman who understood exactly what we were. Two scared kids playing at being brave, running away from something that existed only in their own imaginations. "Pete still around?" I asked. "Oh yeah, he's at the old folks' home now, but his mind's still sharp." "Why?" "I think I'd like to talk to him." Pete Saunders was 86 years old and confined to a wheelchair, but his memory was crystal clear when it came to Elizabeth Crane. He remembered her well, a quiet, dignified woman who always paid her bills in cash and never caused any trouble. "Shame what happened to her story," he said, shaking his head sadly. "Elizabeth was a good woman, just different from the rest of us. But different scares people, especially in a place like Cedar Falls." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, she was educated for one thing. Had a college degree, which was pretty unusual for women back then, especially around here. And she was interested in things most folks didn't understand: botany, wildlife, Native American history. She used to ask me questions about the Cherokee who used to live in these mountains, wanted to know about their customs and beliefs." Pete adjusted his blanket and gazed out the window toward the mountains. Truth is, Elizabeth probably knew more about the real history of this area than anybody. She spent years studying the old Cherokee settlements, documenting the plants they used for medicine, that sort of thing. Even learned some of their language, from what I understand. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Their language?" "Oh yes. She had books about it, dictionaries and such. Used to practice speaking it, I suppose. Probably sounded pretty strange to anyone who overheard her." I thought about Marcus's cousin Jimmy, who claimed to have heard her speaking in a foreign tongue. Not witchcraft after all, but the remnants of a culture that had called these mountains home long before any of us were born. Did she ever have any visitors? Anyone who might have understood what she was trying to do? Pete's expression grew sad. "That's the tragedy of it, son. Near as I know, Elizabeth Crane lived alone in that hollow for 40 years, without a single friend. Oh, she was polite enough when she came to town, always said hello and thank you like she'd been raised right. But I don't think she ever had what you'd call a real conversation with anybody in Cedar Falls." "Why not?" "Because people were afraid of her, afraid of what they didn't understand. And the more afraid they got, the wilder the stories became. By the time you and your friend took that hike, half the town believed she was some kind of dangerous witch. The other half just thought she was crazy." Pete leaned forward in his wheelchair, fixing me with a steady gaze. "But I'll tell you something else, son. In all the years she lived up there, never once did anybody report any real trouble from that hollow. No missing children, no cursed crops. None of the things people claim to be afraid of. The only harm Elizabeth Crane ever did was living different from everybody else." I left the nursing home that day with a heavy heart, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Something about Elizabeth Crane's death bothered me. The way Pete had mentioned it so casually, the fact that she'd been dead for months before anyone found her. That evening I drove to the county courthouse and spent 2 hours going through old records, looking for anything related to Elizabeth Crane. What I found made me understand why the people of Cedar Falls had been so eager to believe the worst about her. Elizabeth Crane hadn't just been a widow. According to the records, she'd been married to a man named Robert Crane, who'd died in the Pacific Theater in 1943. But there was more to it than that. Robert Crane had been killed at Guadalcanal, and Elizabeth had been pregnant when she got the news. The baby, a daughter named Sarah, had been born in early 1944. but according to the death records, Sarah Crane had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1946, when she was barely 2 years old. Elizabeth had lost her husband and her child within 3 years of each other. No wonder she'd wanted to disappear into the mountains, to live somewhere where she wouldn't have to face the pity and questions of well-meaning neighbors. But the records told me something else, too. Elizabeth Crane had died in January of 1989, but her death certificate was dated March 15th, nearly 2 months later. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, but there was a note in the margin that made my blood run cold. Body discovered in advanced state of decomposition. Estimated time of death, mid-January. She'd been dead for 2 months before anyone in Cedar Falls had bothered to check on her. I drove home that night thinking about loneliness, about how a person could live for 40 years in a community and still die alone and forgotten. But I was also thinking about something else, something that had been nagging at me since my conversation with Pete Saunders. If Elizabeth Crane had died in January of 1989, and we'd seen her in October of 1987, then she'd been alive when Marcus and I made our terrified flight from Crow's Hollow. She'd been a living woman, filling her bucket at the creek, who'd looked at 2 frightened boys and smiled. But if that was true, then what was it we'd actually seen that day? What had made us run in such terror from a lonely old woman who'd never hurt anyone in her life? I never did find a satisfactory answer to that question. But I did drive up to Crow's Hollow the next morning before I left Cedar Falls for the last time. The cabin was gone, of course. Nothing left but a foundation of stacked stones and a chimney that rose like a monument from the weeds. The creek still trickled through the hollow, and the trees still bore those carved symbols. Field markers, as Marcus had said, left by a woman who'd loved these mountains enough to spend her life studying them. But standing there in that quiet hollow, I felt the same oppressive silence we'd experienced as children, the same sense that something was watching, waiting, remembering. And when a cloud passed over the sun and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat, I found myself looking around nervously, half expecting to see a small figure in a brown dress standing by the water. The feeling passed, but it left me with a question that I've never been able to answer. Elizabeth Crane was a real woman who lived a real life and died a real death. The Witch of Crow's Hollow was nothing but a story, born of fear and ignorance and the human need to explain the unexplainable. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is high and the old house creaks around me, I find myself wondering if there's more to it than that. Because the truth is, there are some places in these mountains that feel different. Places where the boundary between the living and the dead seems thinner than it ought to be. Places where 40 years of loneliness and sorrow might leave a mark that doesn't fade with time. I don't know if Marcus and I really saw Elizabeth Crane that October day, or if we saw something else, some echo of her grief, some shadow of the life she might have lived if the world had been kinder to her. But I do know this: Crow's Hollow is still empty, and the people of Cedar Falls still don't like to talk about what happened up there. Maybe some stories are too true to be just stories. Maybe some ghosts are too real to be just ghosts. I was 24 when it happened, fresh out of college and full of that particular brand of confidence that comes from thinking you know more about the world than you actually do. My best friend Jake and I had decided to tackle a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. Nothing too ambitious, just a 3-day hike from Rockfish Gap to Reed's Gap, about 30 miles through some of the prettiest country you'll find anywhere in the Blue Ridge. It was early October, peak leaf season, and the mountains were painted in every shade of red and gold you could imagine. The kind of weather that makes you understand why people fall in love with these mountains in the first place. We'd started early that morning, our packs loaded with enough gear for 2 nights on the trail, and by late afternoon we were making good time toward Three Ridges Shelter, where we planned to spend our first night. Jake had been my roommate senior year, and we'd done plenty of hiking together around campus, but this was our first real backpacking trip. He was one of those guys who approached everything with methodical precision. His pack was organized, with military efficiency, and he'd spent weeks studying trail maps and weather reports. Me, I was more of a wing-it kind of hiker, which drove him crazy but somehow worked out most of the time. According to the guidebook, we should hit the shelter in about another mile, Jake said, adjusting his pack straps as we climbed steadily through a stand of mature oaks. Says it sleeps 8, has a privy, and there's a reliable water source about 100 yards down the Blue Blaze Trail. You memorized the whole guidebook, didn't you? I asked, pausing to catch my breath. Even in good shape, the Virginia mountains could humble you quickly. Just being prepared. You never know what you might run into out here. The shelter appeared through the trees exactly where Jake's guidebook said it would. A simple 3-sided log structure with a peaked roof and a raised sleeping platform. A fire ring sat about 20 feet in front of it, surrounded by several flat rocks that served as chairs. It was the kind of place that had probably looked exactly the same for decades, weathered but solid, built to last through countless mountain winters. We weren't alone. A couple was already there, their gear spread out along one end of the sleeping platform. They looked to be in their early 30s, both wearing expensive hiking clothes that looked like they'd come straight from an eerie catalog. The woman was sitting on the edge of the platform, picking at her fingernails, while the man crouched by the fire ring, trying to get a flame started with what appeared to be damp wood. "Afternoon," Jake called out as we approached. "Mind if we share the shelter?" The man looked up from his struggling fire and forced a smile. "Course not. Plenty of room for everybody." His name was Derek, and hers was Amanda. They'd been hiking for 2 days, they said, coming down from Shenandoah National Park. Everything about their setup suggested experienced hikers. Lightweight gear, well-worn boots, the kind of easy efficiency that comes from spending a lot of time on the trail. But something felt off from the moment we started talking. It wasn't anything obvious at first. Derek was friendly enough, asking us about our route and sharing information about trail conditions ahead. Amanda was quieter, but that wasn't unusual. Some people just aren't chatty around strangers. What bothered me was the tension between them, the way they seemed to be having a completely different conversation beneath the polite small talk. "Water's down that trail about 5 minutes," Derek said, pointing toward a blue-blazed path that disappeared into the woods. "Fair warning, though. It's a bit of a steep scramble down to the spring." "Thanks," I said. "We'll grab some before it gets dark." Amanda stood up abruptly from the platform. "I'm going to walk around a bit, get some air." Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Don't go too far. It'll be dark soon." She shot him a look that could have cut glass. "I think I can manage a short walk without getting lost." Jake and I exchanged glances as she stalked off down the trail, her footsteps heavy with barely controlled anger. Derek went back to his fire building with perhaps a bit more violence than necessary, snapping twigs and muttering under his breath. "Everything okay?" I asked, because the silence was getting uncomfortable. "Yeah, we're fine," Derek said, not looking up. "Just one of those things, you know. Spend too much time together on the trail and everybody gets a little cranky." I understood that. Trail marriages and trail divorces were common enough. The stress of hiking, sleeping rough, and being constantly in each other's company could test any relationship. But this felt like more than ordinary trail tension. Amanda came back about 20 minutes later, just as Derek finally got his fire going. She didn't say anything, just sat down on one of the rocks and stared into the flames. The silence stretched out like a physical thing, and I found myself wishing Jake and I had pushed on to the next shelter. We made dinner in that awkward quiet, Jake and I sharing our freeze-dried pasta while Derek and Amanda ate separately, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. Conversation was limited to practical matters, weather forecasts, trail conditions, the usual hiker small talk that fills the gaps when nobody really wants to talk. As full dark settled over the mountains, Amanda stood up again. This time she grabbed her headlamp and started walking toward the trail that led back the way we'd all come. "Where are you going?" Derek asked, and there was something sharp in his voice that made me look up from my camp stove. "For a walk. I need some space." "It's dark, Amanda, and we don't know this area." She turned around, and in the firelight I could see her face was flushed with anger. "I need some space. This is ridiculous. We need to talk about—" "No," she cut him off. "We don't need to talk about anything. I'm going for a walk, and when I get back, maybe you'll have figured out how to act like a human being." She switched on her headlamp and started down the trail, the beam of light bouncing erratically as she walked. "Amanda!" Derek called after her, but she didn't stop. Within minutes, the sound of her footsteps had faded into the night, and we were left sitting around the fire in uncomfortable silence. Derek sat back down heavily, running his hands through his hair. "Sorry about that. We've been having some issues. Maybe you should go after her," Jake suggested quietly. Derek shook his head. "She needs time to cool off. She'll be back." But as the minutes ticked by and turned into an hour, then two, I started to wonder if she would be back. The mountains at night were no place for an angry hike, even with a headlamp. Too many things could go wrong. A twisted ankle, a wrong turn, a simple stumble that could leave you hurt and alone in the dark. Derek seemed to be thinking the same thing. He kept checking his watch and staring down the trail, his earlier confidence beginning to crack around the edges. "Maybe I should go look for her," he said finally. "Let's give her a little more time," I suggested, though I wasn't sure why. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was bothering me. We were just starting to discuss a search plan when we heard it. A scream that cut through the night air like a knife through cloth. It came from somewhere down the trail, in the direction Amanda had gone, and it was filled with pure terror. "Oh God," Derek breathed, jumping to his feet. "That's Amanda." Jake and I were already grabbing our headlamps, but Derek was ahead of us, crashing down the trail into the darkness. We followed as quickly as we could, our lights bouncing wildly. As we ran through the trees, the scream came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like a sob. "Help me! Somebody help me!" We found her maybe a quarter-mile down the trail, sitting on the ground with her back against a large oak tree. Her headlamp was gone, and in the beam of our lights we could see that her face was streaked with tears and dirt. Her left leg was bent at an odd angle, and dark stains on her hiking pants suggested blood. "Amanda." Derek dropped to his knees beside her. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "My leg," she gasped. "I think it's broken. And my head." She touched her forehead, and her fingers came away dark with blood. "How did this happen?" I asked, scanning the area with my headlamp. The trail here was rough, but not particularly treacherous. Nothing that should have caused injuries this severe. Amanda's eyes were wide with shock, darting from face to face in the overlapping beams of our lights. "Someone attacked me. They came out of nowhere, and I tried to run, but I fell and—" "Someone attacked you?" Jake interrupted. "Who? Where are they now?" "I don't know. I couldn't see them clearly. They grabbed me from behind, and when I screamed and tried to get away, I tripped over something and went down hard. I hit my head on a rock, and when I came to, whoever it was gone." Derek was examining her leg as gently as he could. "This looks bad, Amanda. We need to get you to a hospital." "Did you see anything?" I asked, playing my light through the trees around us. "Hear anything? Which direction did they go?" She shook her head, wincing at the movement. "It happened so fast. One second I was walking, trying to clear my head, and the next someone had their hands on me. I don't even know if it was a man or a woman. The woods around us were perfectly silent except for our breathing and the distant sound of wind through the leaves. Whoever had attacked Amanda was either long gone or very good at staying hidden. Either possibility made my skin crawl. "We need to get her back to the shelter," Jake said. "Get her warm and figure out what to do next." It took all three of us to get Amanda back up the trail. Derek and I made a seat with our interlocked arms while Jake carried the packs and lit the way. She was heavier than she looked, and by the time we reached the shelter, we were all exhausted and on edge. Once we had her settled on the sleeping platform with her leg elevated and her head wound cleaned, Derek tried his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the mountains. Jake tried his GPS device, but it would only tell us where we were, not summon help. "We're going to have to hike out in the morning," Derek said. "Get her to the road and call for an ambulance." "What if whoever did this is still out there?" I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since we'd found Amanda. "What if they come back?" Derek's face was grim in the firelight. "Then we'll deal with it." But how do you deal with an unknown threat in the middle of nowhere? We had no weapons except our hiking poles and camp knives. No way to call for help. No way to know if we were dealing with one attacker or several, or what they might want. Amanda had fallen into an exhausted sleep, but the rest of us sat by the dying fire, listening to every sound from the darkness beyond. A snapping twig became an approaching footstep. The rustle of leaves became someone moving through the underbrush. An owl call became a signal between conspirators. Around midnight, Jake nudged me awake. I hadn't even realized I'd dozed off. "Listen," he whispered. I held my breath and strained my ears. At first, I heard nothing but the usual night sounds of the forest. Then I caught it, the soft sound of footsteps circling the shelter, slow and deliberate, like someone was taking their time to study our position. Derek was awake too, his hand gripping a hiking pole like a weapon. We sat in tense silence, tracking. The movement by sound alone, whoever it was made a complete circuit of the shelter, staying just far enough back in the trees that our headlamps couldn't pick them out. Then the footsteps stopped. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, Jake whispered, "Maybe they're gone." As if in response, something hit the side of the shelter with a loud thunk. We all jumped, and Amanda woke with a startled cry. "What was that?" she asked. "Someone threw something at the shelter," Derek said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Probably a rock." Why would someone do that? None of us had an answer. The harassment continued sporadically through the night. Rocks thrown at the shelter, branches snapping just beyond the range of our lights, the occasional sound of footsteps moving through the woods around us. It was psychological warfare, designed to keep us awake and afraid, and it was working perfectly. By the time dawn finally broke over the mountains, we were all exhausted and jumpy. Amanda's leg had swollen during the night, and she was running a low fever that suggested infection was setting in. We needed to get her medical attention, and we needed to get out of there. The hike out was a nightmare. We'd fashioned a makeshift stretcher from hiking poles and a tarp, but carrying Amanda down the rocky trail was slow, dangerous work. Every rustle in the bushes made us freeze, expecting another attack. Every bend in the trail could hide an ambush, but nothing happened. Whoever had terrorized us through the night seemed to have vanished with the darkness. We reached the parking area at Reed's Gap around noon, dirty, exhausted, and rattled. Derek drove Amanda to the hospital in Waynesboro while Jake and I waited for the sheriff's deputy who'd been called to take our statements. Deputy Miller was a middle-aged man with the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every story at least twice. He listened to our account with professional interest, taking notes and asking the occasional clarifying question, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "So none of you actually saw this attacker?" he asked. "It was dark," I said, "and it happened fast." "And the victim, Amanda, she couldn't provide a description?" "She said it was too dark to see clearly, and she hit her head pretty hard when she fell." Deputy Miller closed his notepad and sighed. "I'll file a report, and we'll have our people keep an eye on that section of trail for the next few weeks. But I have to be honest with you, without a description of the suspect or any physical evidence, there's not much we can do." "What about the rocks that were thrown at the shelter? The harassment during the night?" "Could have been animals. Bears, maybe, or a curious raccoon. Happens more often than you'd think." Jake and I exchanged looks. We both knew what we'd experienced, and it hadn't been animals. "Has there been other trouble in that area?" I asked. "Other attacks?" The deputy's expression shifted slightly. "Nothing official. But we do get the occasional complaint about strange activity up in those mountains. Hikers reporting they felt like they were being watched, campsites disturbed, that sort of thing." "And you don't investigate?" "We investigate everything that gets reported. But most of the time there's nothing to find. The mountains can play tricks on people, especially at night. Fear and imagination can make perfectly normal sounds seem threatening." I wanted to argue, to insist that what we'd experienced was real and specific and dangerous. But looking at Deputy Miller's skeptical expression, I realized it would be pointless. He'd heard it all before. And without evidence, our story was just another tale of spooked hikers jumping at shadows. Derek called later that evening to update us on Amanda's condition. Her leg was broken in 2 places and would require surgery. The head wound needed stitches but wasn't serious. She'd be in the hospital for several days, but she was expected to make a full recovery. Did she remember anything else about the attack? I asked. No, nothing. The doctor said head injuries can affect memory, especially of traumatic events. She might never remember exactly what happened. Jake and I drove back to our respective homes the next day, but the experience stayed with us. Over the following weeks, I found myself checking online forums and news sites, looking for any reports of similar incidents on the Appalachian Trail. I found a few scattered accounts, hikers who reported being followed, campsites that were mysteriously disturbed, the occasional story of someone being threatened or harassed on remote sections of trail, but nothing concrete, nothing that would constitute a pattern or point to a specific threat. Amanda and Derek's relationship didn't survive the trip. Derek told me later that she blamed him for letting her walk off alone that night, while he felt guilty for not going after her immediately. The trauma of the attack, combined with whatever issues they'd been dealing with before, proved too much for them to overcome. That was 15 years ago now. I still hike the Appalachian Trail occasionally, though I've never been back to 3 Ridges Shelter. Jake moved to Colorado after graduate school, and we exchange Christmas cards but rarely talk. Derek disappeared from my social media feeds years ago, and I have no idea what happened to Amanda. But sometimes, when I'm lying in my tent on a remote section of trail, listening to the night sounds of the forest, I find myself thinking about that October night in Virginia, about the footsteps circling our shelter, the rocks thrown from the darkness, the careful, patient way someone had terrorized us through those long hours before dawn. The official explanation was that Amanda had been attacked by person or persons unknown, possibly transients or local troublemakers who fled the scene after she was injured. The harassment at the shelter was written off as coincidence, animals, or our own imagination, amplified by stress and fear. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe the real story is simpler and more mundane than the one that's lived in my memory all these years. Maybe Amanda tripped in the dark, hit her head, and in her confusion mistook an innocent fall for an attack. Maybe the sounds we heard were really just animals, and our fear turned routine forest noises into something sinister. But I don't think that's what happened. I think someone was out there that night, someone who knew the mountains well enough to move through them silently in complete darkness, someone who enjoyed frightening people, who got satisfaction from the power that comes with being the hunter instead of the prey. We never did learn who attacked Amanda or why they chose her. We never found out who threw those rocks at our shelter or what they wanted from us. And maybe that's the most frightening thing of all, knowing that somewhere out there in the mountains, someone is still walking the trails, still watching, still waiting for the next group of hikers to make camp in the wrong place at the wrong time.